let's talk about hormones. Hey everyone, this is a lecture on the endocrine system. All right, let's start with a video.
We began this test with a simple question. Does adrenaline really increase performance? Could added adrenaline allow mixed martial arts star Houston the Assassin Alexander to actually punch with more force? We first established a baseline to see how hard Houston hits without adrenaline. Then we got him mad. Really mad.
All that rage, I want it right now. I want you to unleash that beast. Come on, man. You can do this. No more disappointment anymore. Let's go.
Flooded with natural adrenaline, Houston hit the crash test dummy with an amazing 1,000 pounds of force. That's 400 pounds. Or 60% more force than he produced during the baseline. Now, there's one last test to run. How hard will Houston hit when we actually inject him with a shot of pure adrenaline?
You ready to do this?
Come on.
Here we go. Line yourself up. Check if he's all right. Check if he's all right.
Houston, I'm gonna check your pupils.
How did the injection of epinephrine affect Houston's power? Remember, his baseline punch with no adrenaline registered at 600 pounds of force. Then, enraged by his trainer,
Let me see it. You got me. Hit that thing. Let's go.
his natural adrenaline produced a punch with 1,000 pounds of force. And finally, jacked up on a dose of epinephrine, Houston delivered a punch with only 900 pounds of force. Incredibly, that's less powerful than the one fueled by his trainer's motivation.
All right, now that was a crazy video because, they set out to test whether Houston, the Assassin Alexander, was going to punch with a greater force when under the influence of adrenaline, right? So under no adrenaline treatment, adrenaline, natural adrenaline, and then jacked up on a injection of pure adrenaline. Now, interestingly, they said, oh, he only punched with less force, only 900 pounds of force under the adrenaline injection, so it didn't change. But did you see what happened? He almost took the head off of that crash test dummy. He punched that thing 12 times and then screamed like, ah, and then started crying. I mean, that's what happens when you get jacked up on adrenaline. So much so, the guy in the blue told the scientist in the lab coat, you go check him, check if he's okay. Anyway, so hormones, okay, that can really, really affect how you feel and how you act. So before we start talking about just hormones, let's step back in time a little more than 100 years ago to discuss the first experiment in the field of endocrinology, which is the study of hormones. All right, well, we had these gentlemen that they were scientists and they had a question, right? The question was, how does the pancreas secrete its digestive juice into the small intestine at the proper time? They're like, I mean, they made the observation. The question is made on the observation that when food goes from the stomach to the duodenum of the small intestine, it just happens that at that time the pancreas decides to inject its digestive juice. So how does the pancreas know that? Well, they had a hypothesis, right? They're scientists. So they thought that acidic food entering the intestine is triggered a nervous reflex that releases the pancreatic juice. So they knew about nerves, so they hypothesized that there's some nerve. Okay, so it's time to do an experiment. So someone get a dog in here and cut its nerve out. So they took a dog, they cut the nerve, serving the small intestine. Of course, they anesthetized it. They're not monsters. But then they fed the dog and then they injected just straight up acid into its intestine, and the expectation was that if their hypothesis was correct, that the pancreas would inject its pancreatic juice. Well, guess what happened? The expectation was that the pancreas would fail to inject its pancreatic juice, and what they observed is that there was still plenty of pancreatic juice flowing into the intestine, even without a nerve. So they concluded that it's not a nervous reflex, but it has to be some sort of chemical messenger that is circulating through the blood from the intestine to the pancreas, thus causing the pancreas to secrete. And they called it secretin, the first hormone ever discovered. Interestingly, the pancreas is an endocrine gland that itself secretes hormones, but in this experiment, the pancreas was acting as an exocrine gland, and it was a target of a hormone that was secreted by the small intestine. So let's just talk about hormones now more in general. You've heard the term, you've all gone through puberty, you've felt hormonal. What are hormones? Well, in general, hormones are chemical compounds released into the blood in small amounts and transported by the circulatory system throughout the body to distinct target cells where they initiate physiological responses. All right. However, some hormones don't enter the general circulation, and they function instead as neurotransmitters in the brain. For example, remember norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter of the sympathetic nervous system, as we discussed last time when we discussed the nervous system. Now, we've talked about glands before, I think in the context of discussing the skin of mammals. Remember, we talked about mammary glands and sweat glands and sebaceous glands. Well, none of those glands are glands that secrete hormones. The ones that secrete hormones are called endocrine glands. Those are glands that are ductless, and they release their hormone products directly into the blood. The glands that I mentioned, like the mammary glands and sweat glands, those are exocrine glands. They are going to release their products into a duct, into a little tube. So one example of an endocrine gland is the pancreas, and one example of an exocrine gland is also the pancreas. Some glands have both endocrine and exocrine functions. And this diagram here illustrates some of the major endocrine glands, such as the pineal gland in the brain, the pituitary gland just hanging off here at the base of the brain, the thyroid gland, the throat region, the thymus gland, kind of over the heart, the adrenal gland that sits on top of the kidneys, here's the pancreas by the intestine, and of course the gonads. In females, those are the ovaries, and in males, they are the testes. Now, we discussed last time that the nervous system is a communication system, and now here we're discussing the endocrine system as another communication system, and yes, that's because the body has two communication systems, right? Just like you can send a text message to your friend or an email to your friend, they'll get it instantaneously, or you can send the old-fashioned way, card, put it in the mail, and your friend will get it like in a week. Well, the two communication systems that we have in our body work similarly. One is fast and one is slow. Now, the nervous system is fast and it relies on electrochemical signals that travel quickly through neurons and they produce really short-term responses. Whereas the endocrine system relies on chemical signals that travel slowly through blood and they produce more long-lasting responses. Let me show you.
Oh, भाई साहब,
All right, so those people almost died, right? And if you've had a similar experience where you almost died, your nervous system makes you react very, very quickly. But even after the threat is gone, like even after the train passed, those people must have been sweating and their hearts were racing and jumping out of their chest, right? So that is the long-lasting effect of hormones. Okay, let's talk about the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. These are very, very important glands. Check out this figure from the textbook, 34.5. Here we have a mid-sagittal section of a human brain, and you see here's the corpus callosum, and then here at the bottom of the brain is this little P-shaped thing just dangling there. If we zoom in, we'll see that, oh, that is the pituitary gland. And it's connected to the hypothalamus here. Connected to the hypothalamus here by this narrow stalk called the infundibulum. Now, the pituitary gland is small, but it itself is split into the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Now, if we zoom in these lobes and look at how they are wired, we will see some interesting things. Well, first, the posterior lobe over here is connected directly to the hypothalamus by the axons of these neurosecretory cells. So these neurosecretory cells, they're neurons, but they are essentially secreting hormones and dumping them here into the posterior lobe of the pituitary. And we'll get into that later on. That'll show you which hormones. However, on the anterior lobe, that lobe is indirectly connected to the hypothalamus by this capillary network. And that capillary network begins here at the base of the hypothalamus, where these neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus are going to dump their hormones into the bloodstream here. Those hormones are going to go down and then enter the anterior lobe of the pituitary, where they're going to have an effect on the anterior lobe on this tissue. This tissue is going to be producing a separate set of hormones, which I'll discuss in just a moment. Okay, so this is the next figure in the textbook that shows the relationships of the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and some other target gland. In this case, the adrenal gland is used as an example. So we call this the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Often, the pituitary gland is referred to as the master gland, but the master gland itself has a master and is actually regulated by the hypothalamus. So let's start here. This is a neuron of the hypothalamus, right? This is a region in the brain, so it's made out of neurons. This is a neuron in the brain that is going to be producing and releasing a hormone, in this case, corticotropin releasing hormone. It's going to dump this hormone into this capillary, which is in this figure, these capillaries over here. That hormone is going to travel down into the anterior lobe of the pituitary, where it's going to enter those cells, and it's going to stimulate these cells to make their own hormones. In this case, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Well, ACTH is going to enter the bloodstream. It would enter the bloodstream here and then go down this vein that drains the pituitary gland, and it eventually is going to find its target. In this case, it will be a cell of the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland. And ACTH is going to stimulate this gland to produce its own hormone, in this case, cortisol, which then is going to go into the bloodstream and have its effects in various target organs. So you see, basically the hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary, which stimulates some other gland, which then stimulates some target tissue. Now, the anterior pituitary is called the master gland because it produces, well, the pituitary itself produces many hormones. The anterior lobe of the pituitary produces 7 of them, 4 of which are called tropic hormones. And they're called tropic hormones because they regulate other endocrine glands. For example, thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, is made in the anterior pituitary. And TSH is also called thyrotropin because it stimulates the thyroid hormone, the thyroid gland, to produce thyroid hormone. The follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and the luteinizing hormone, LH, are called gonadotropins because they stimulate the gonads. In females, follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the ovaries to mature their ova, their eggs, and in males, FSH is going to stimulate the testes to produce sperm. In females, LH is going to stimulate the female gonads, the ovaries, to produce steroid hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And LH in males is going to stimulate the gonads, the testes, to produce the male steroid hormones, testosterone. The fourth The fourth tropic hormone here is ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. It's going to stimulate the adrenal gland to produce also its hormones, like I just showed you in the HPA axis. It's going to the ACTH stimulates the adrenal gland to produce cortisol. So those are the four tropic hormones of the anterior pituitary. Then there are a few more. There's growth hormone, which you've probably heard about in the news lately, especially some athletes like to abuse growth hormone. There is prolactin, the hormone that stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk. And then there's melanocyte stimulating hormone, which in many vertebrates stimulates the melanocytes to produce melanin, but its function is uncertain in humans or in mammals. All right, those were the hormones of the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is a little bit different. Remember that the posterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus directly through these neurosecretory axons. So it is actually the hypothalamus that is the source of the two hormones of the posterior pituitary. In a sense, the posterior lobe of the pituitary is actually not an endocrine gland, but just a storage center for those hypothalamic hormones. But the hormones that are stored and released from the posterior pituitary include oxytocin, which you may have heard of. Oxytocin is or functions in pair bonding. It is released during sexual orgasm and is what makes sexual partners feel bonded together and feel like cuddling. It is also released during parturition, during birth, and it is what makes new mothers bond with their infants. And then the other hormone is vasopressin, which is also called antidiuretic hormone. It essentially promotes reabsorption of water in the kidneys, and so it decreases the amount of urine that the kidneys make. Now, notice interestingly that these two hormones are fairly simple proteins, and they are remarkably identical except for these two amino acids in these two positions. So they are thought to have a similar evolutionary origin. Okay, I won't get into these details because you can read. So check out table 34.1 and study out these hormones of the pituitary and their principal actions, what they do. All right, this is really important here, this topic of endocrine disruption. This is where endocrinology meets ecology in a field called ecotoxicology. You know what xenophobia is, right? The fear of foreign people. Well, xenobiotics are chemicals that are foreign, xeno, but they have a biotic function, and that is very similar to hormones. That's because the chemical structure of these xenobiotics is so similar to hormones that they may be perceived by the body as hormones, and therefore they can have effects on our bodies, because that's what hormones do, and disrupt the body's normal functioning. Now, some xenobiotics are xenoestrogens, right? They function like estrogens. And BPA, bisphenol A, is one of them. You may have heard of BPA because it has had a lot of press, a lot of bad press lately, so many products now are labeled BPA free. But BPA is just one of many xenoestrogens that are really ubiquitous. I mean, they're in a wide variety of manufactured products like plastics and makeup and shampoo and deodorant and just a lot of things that we apply to ourselves. So our bodies are constantly being exposed to these xenobiotics, many of which are xenoestrogens. So think about this. How may xenoestrogens affect human reproductive systems, right? I mean, how does estrogen function normally? And what if we expose our body to all of these foreign chemicals that act like estrogens in our bodies? Well, this is really important because there have been some recent alarming trends in both males and females. For example, it has been shown in males that there is a trend, like a feminizing trend of lower ejaculate volumes, right? So lower volume of semen, of lower sperm counts, and lower sperm quality as measured by sperm motility. So they're less sperm and they're weaker sperm, essentially. And it's thought that those trends are connected to the ubiquitous presence of xenoestrogens. Similarly, in females that naturally produce lots of estrogen, well, more estrogen is not necessarily a good thing. There has been a trend of an earlier onset of puberty, so earlier development of breasts in young girls, earlier onset of first menstruation in young girls, and again, it is believed that this trend is partly due to this ubiquitous presence of xenoestrogens in our environment and in the products that we use. So that's it. Check out these sections in the main textbook that we've been using, but also this chapter 13 in the book Conservation Biology for All, and just specifically this box 13.1, which highlights that topic that I just discussed about xenoestrogens, because it's not just an issue for human health, but it's also an issue for wildlife populations that are many animals which happen to be smaller than us are going to be more affected by the presence of these xenobiotics. And then here are some review or preview questions to guide your study, and these are found in your study guide.